mean, we have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period. So, I mean, you know, I'm not saying this as a believer. I'm not a believer. But as a historian, I'm just saying that you can't just kind of dismiss it and say, well, you know, we don't know. I mean, you have to look at the evidence. So there is hard evidence, I think.
Okay. I would look for archaeological evidence as well.
For example, we have one author who actually knew Jesus' relatives and knew his disciples.
And who's that?
Paul.
How do we know that?
Because we have Paul's letters.
How do we know he didn't lie about it?
Why would he lie about it?
Well,
the point.
But there are people. There are people. But
Paul says things about Jesus as off-the-cuff comments, where he's not making a point. And see, that's very important to historians. In other words, a historian wants to find disinterested comments.
Right.
And Paul has disinterested comments where he says things, for example, about James, the brother of the Lord, which is just an off-the-cuff comment because everybody that he's writing to knows who he's talking about. So he just makes the off-the-cuff comment. That's very important information.
And that is, if he wrote them.
Disciples. Now,
if he even wrote that
comment about the 12 disciples, if in fact, so the whole point is that you've got a disinterested comment from somebody who actually knew these people.
If he even wrote that, though, correct? Because isn't there some?
No, there's no doubt about Paul writing Galatians.
Aren't there some theories that suggest that maybe Paul himself had scribes that wrote for him?
Every person who wrote epistles in the ancient world dictated them to scribes.
Right. So how do we know then that?
Well, how do you know Cicero wrote his letters?
I don't. I'm not a historian, so I don't know much about Cicero. But
well, I am a historian, and I'm telling you.
But there are some. but there are many historians who disagree with you, aren't they?
No, none that I've ever heard of.
Oh, really?
Well, not serious historians.
Not serious historians.
Listen, I know thousands of scholars of the ancient world, and I don't know any one of these scholars who doubts that Paul wrote Galatians.
Okay.
So these are people who've devoted their lives to this, and a lot of them are like me. It's not that I've got a personal investment in Paul. I mean, I'm not even a Christian.
Right.
I'm just saying, as a historian, there's no doubt Paul wrote Galatians. I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. There are a lot of people who want to write sensational books and make a lot of money who say Jesus didn't exist, but I don't know any serious scholar who doubts the existence of Jesus.
The new atheists profess to be interested in evidence, but their attitude to the figure of Jesus tells a very different story. Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and indeed Victor Stenger, whom I debated in Sydney this week, believe that the existence of Jesus is in scholarly dispute. The eminent classicist Professor Graham Clark of the ANU, not a Christian, writes, "Frankly, I know of no ancient historian who would have a twinge of doubt about the existence of Jesus Christ. The documentary evidence is simply overwhelming." Clearly the new atheists didn't check, at least with historians, but they did check with some other people. In The God Delusion, Dawkins quotes a certain Professor Wells. Stenger quoted him to me the other night. But neither Dawkins or Stenger tell us that Wells is a professor of German in London. What would Dawkins think, I wonder, if I got my information on biology from a professor of Mandarin?
But I would say, with very, very few exceptions, virtually no scholar doubts or denies that Jesus existed. Now, I can think of a couple. G.A. Wells, but he's out of his field. He's a professor of German, but he's well known for this view. And a philosopher, Michael Martin, who even acknowledges, he says, since this is a very unpopular position, he said, I will not use it in my work. So they even acknowledge, Martin in particular, acknowledges the paucity of professors who take this view. And when I say critical scholars, I'm talking about scholars who have terminal degrees in a area that's important. They have peer-reviewed publications, and this is the area, historical Jesus, miracles, resurrection. This is the area they work in. And from that group, You can go to historical Jesus people, you go to Jesus seminar people, you can go to the left of Jesus seminar people. You almost never hear a doubt voiced about the historical existence of Jesus.
Right away, I want to talk about the historicity of Jesus, because some people, notably those who are sort of a new atheist bent, might say something along the lines of, well, we don't know if Jesus even existed. Or they might say, Jesus, if he existed, and then they'll go on and say something about him. But what do you, as an historian specializing in this area, have to say when you hear that sort of assertion?
Well, anybody who is using that argument is simply flaunting his ignorance. I hate to say it, but it's about that bad. We have more documentation on Jesus Christ than anybody in the ancient world as far as that's concerned. There's no question whatever in the mind of any serious scholar anywhere in the world that there certainly was a historical personality named Jesus of Nazareth. Now, you can argue about whether he was the Son of God or not. You can argue about the supernatural aspects of his life. But in terms of the historical character, there is absolutely no evidence to the contrary, and all the evidence is in the favor. And I just can't stand the computer blogs and so many other would-be authorities trying to use this argument. He's only a myth. He never lived. Well, that's simply ridiculous on the face of the fact.
Did you find any serious historical work in the list of references?
Not a single one. What I found is a whole list of books claiming to be written by experts, quoting other people claiming to be experts, quoting actually none of the ancient evidence at all.
And yet a lot of people have been enamoured with this movie or deeply troubled by it. What is your advice to them?
Can I be awfully blunt? Don't believe everything you see on YouTube.
Given that this interview will also be on YouTube, have you got any further advice for them?
Yes. Check references. Go looking for ancient evidence. If somebody claims something about Horus or Mithras or Dionysus, if they're only quoting another modern author, or in the case of Massey, someone writing in the 19th century, that's not good enough. What historians want to know is not do you quote historians, they want to know can you quote ancient evidence. And there's simply no ancient evidence that Horus or Mithras or Dionysus was born on the 25th of December, born of a virgin, crucified. The ancient stories simply don't say that about them. So the parallels with Jesus just collapse.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
You do it like this.
Joining me is Tim Callahan, religion editor of Skeptic Magazine and author of Secret Origins of the Bible. And Dr. Gary Habermas, who's considered one of the world's leading authorities on the resurrection. He chairs the Philosophy and Theology Department at Liberty University, has written several books on the resurrection, his most recent being The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Well, Tim, let me start with you. In your book, you suggest that the resurrection of Jesus isn't original at all, but it's merely a story that was recycled from earlier mythology and mystery religions. You specifically in your book mention the stories of Osiris, Adonis, and Attis. Could you explain what all this means?
Well, the resurrection is, again, there were death and resurrection stories going all the way back, as you said, to Isis and Osiris, and usually in Dionysus, out of Greek mythology, he had his own separate cult, and in all of these, they die an excruciating death of some sort. Dionysus is torn to pieces and eaten by the Titans. And then they rise physically from the dead.
So you're saying that this Jesus story then is just a recapitulation of this earlier mythology?
Well, not necessarily exactly a recapitulation, but I think that basically the evidence for it is lacking.
Okay. Dr. Habermas, what's your response to that?
Let's take Adonis. Adonis is probably the ancient god for which we have the clearest data that he was raised from the dead. We have 4 accounts that Adonis was raised. The earliest one is the 2nd century A.D. The other ones are between the 2nd and 4th century A.D. The earliest account we have for Attis is the 3rd century A.D. And while Isis and Osiris, as a religion, was definitely pre-Christian, there is no resurrection in Isis and Osiris. Osiris in particular is not raised.
Okay, Tim, how do you respond to that?
I would point out that oftentimes the only copies of the myths we have are quite late as far as writings go, but quite often we have some evidence of the myths in the form of pictures on vases of the various mythic characters and the situations of the myths. So we can be pretty sure that they were being told orally a lot earlier.
Go ahead, Dr. Habermas.
If we're talking about stories on vases or in other reliefs, there is still no resurrection. There are no resurrected gods for which we have influence, for which we have data prior to the 2nd century.
Is
like
this
I said,
an objection, Gary, that you get a lot from scholars, that this is the origin of the resurrection of Jesus is somehow based on or influenced by these earlier mythologies?
Well, I've done a count recently of 1,200 sources on the resurrection, everything published since 1975 in German, French, and English. And I went back and I looked how many of these scholars who hold university chairs, for example, how many of them who are not Christians, who do not hold to the resurrection, how many of them would say that in any way the mystery gods are a potential inspiration for Christianity? And I can count the number of skeptics on one hand. I can count them on one hand out of 1,200 scholars. It's a real minority view.
Not entirely. I would still say that that it was a common idea of a dying and rising God was around before Jesus.
Well, that's not what Dr. Habermas said.
We would have to agree to disagree on that.
One of the two of you isn't right.
The point is, Tim, if you're gonna hold to a dying and rising God before Jesus, I want to say, where's the evidence?
Well, I would say that, first of all, that the myth of Dionysus probably does antedate Jesus. And yes, there isn't specifically resurrection, specifically, I mean, crucifixion, but I don't see that that's really that important a point. They all undergo a horrible, excruciating death.
You're going to have to give me a date for the earliest inscription, because Dionysus, I don't know anybody who thinks Dionysus is pre-Christian, not the resurrection portion.
Okay, well, all I can tell you is that the myth is that he is torn apart by the Titans, eaten, and he is raised from the dead.
What is the date?
I don't know. I don't know the date of the, as I said, of the original.
You do it like this.
Blast off.